Hi, you're listening to After Dinner Conversations, short stories for long discussions. What that means is we get short stories, we select those short stories, and then we discuss them specifically about the ethics and the morality of the choices the characters and the situations put us in. Why did you do this? What makes you do this? What makes us good people? What's the nature of truth, goodness, all of that sort of stuff. And hopefully we're all better, smarter people for it and learn a little bit about why we think the way we think. So thank you for listening. Okay, welcome back once again to After Dinner Conversation, short stories for long discussions. I am your co-host Colby, with Ashley.
Hello.
And with Jeremy.
Hi.
And joining us again is Sarah.
Hello.
Hey, Sarah.
Hi.
So our season 2 book is out. Go ahead and get that. Go to our website, afterdinnerconversation.com. You'll find all sorts of stuff. As well as free stories and email lists and all these things. Support us on Patreon at patreon.com/afterdinnerconversation. Like and subscribe. Okay, I got all that out of the way in a reasonable amount of time this time. All right, so Jeremy, I think you've got the 7 Absent Sins. It's by Nathan Ahlgrim.
Nathan Ahlgrim.
Cool, let's hear it. What happens?
All right, so this is an interesting story. I like this one. Basically, from the point of view of a Jesuit priest, it's like a paper that he's submitting to somebody, I don't even know, about the compiled knowledge of the Galactic Confederation of Intelligences. So it's a what do we call it, post-discovery story, where we've been brought into some galactic federation, and so this Jesuit priest is researching all of the sentient species in the galaxy, specifically to find out if they have the same concept of sin that humans do.
Okay.
And specifically the cardinal sins, the seven cardinal sins. And then basically talks about and goes through 7 different species, or 6 technically, who are absent or do not have the capability to commit one of each of these sins. And so it's really just a catalog of these different species, what makes them unique, and why they're unable to have each of these sins. And I mean, we can break it down individually.
And a couple of other things I think that are worth pointing out. No, I think that's great. A couple other things that I think are worth pointing out about the story is you get the impression I think they said there were like 86 sentient species that were sort of in this galactic catalog. Everything from carnivores to herbivores to minerivores, which I guess are animals that live on minerals as opposed to meat or vegetation. And the other thing you mentioned is that I thought was interesting, that maybe that could be our starting point before we get into the meat of the story, is that initially they had shut off Earth from sort of the galactic knowledge. They had basically isolated themselves to keep out this sort of Encyclopedia Galactica and didn't really want to interact with other species and other things because they were worried about like sort of intergalactic influence.
Right.
In the same way maybe Native Americans.
It says it was a defensive measure to reestablish a distinctly and purely human society.
Yeah, I mean, you see this all the time. Like I had roommates for a while that were Welsh, and they specifically went to school to learn Welsh instead of English because there were, very few Welsh speakers left in the world, right? The same way there are very few Native Americans who speak, with the exception of Navajo, which is one of the few that has a few number of speakers. But there's a lot of dying languages, a lot of dying cultures.
I think even similar with French, where French doesn't allow imported vocabulary. They have to have a word for it, or they don't have a word for it. But they don't, like in Japanese, they import a lot of words. And so they just take the English word or the French word or whatever, and it becomes a word in Japanese.
Like internet. That's the one that I always think of, is like it's the same word in practically every language. They just say like like the word internet with whatever local
Right.
accent it is, like a Chinese accent or a Japanese accent or whatever.
Biru.
Yeah, exactly. It's the same thing in Chinese, by the way. That a lot of the times they'll use totally random sounds from other words to mimic the sound of word in English. So the word for McDonald's, because I'm me and I'm not that culturally sensitive, and I had to find out where the McDonald's was in China, is actually Meidan Lao, because those were the three characters they could string together that sounded the most like the word McDonald's.
Okay.
But it's a nonsensical word now because they've put three separate. It would be like, house, cheese, chicken. But it's just,
Right.
so it's a phonetic pronunciation now instead of a character pronunciation.
Right.
I'm just curious what you guys, before you get into the actual cardinal sin part of it, what you guys just thought of the idea of sort of this knowledge protectionism, like we don't want your cable TV sort of thing.
It's a reactionary. I think it's a very reactionary response to the presumed erasure of your culture.
Okay.
Where those things, I think they're going on all the time anyways. We ourselves are jettisoning old parts of our culture and language that we no longer use. So it's just, that this is coming from the outside, so it's a very conservative approach to, your culture is, important in that way.
Okay.
That it needs to be preserved from outside influence.
So okay with this? Not okay? Like, do you think this is the right choice that a culture makes? Because this happens on Earth too, right? Where
Absolutely.
people insist on sort of cultural purity.
Yeah, anytime we get into cultural purity, it makes me really uncomfortable.
Sure.
So like right at the very beginning of the story, I'm already like, ooh, this is gonna be like it's kind of an awkward approach to
just say like, hey, don't like
we
don't,
have to withdraw from the rest of
right.
the universe to
Like-
keep
Yeah.
human, like purely human society.
So what do you
Yeah.
think about this then, Sarah? There for many, because American, just to take this to a more local example, because American movies and music are so prevalent in the world and so sort of invasive in the world, many countries actually have government funds to fund local filmmakers to make films from New Zealand or films from Australia or films from Israel or whatever the case may be, because they want local filmmakers telling local stories to a local audience, even though it might not financially make sense. And part of that is just to sort of not have everything that their residents see be, the Transformers movie. Or something where some American saves the planet or, whatever. Are you okay with, is funding sort of
I don't think-
cultural different than sort of banning?
Yeah, no, completely different. I don't think that's the same thing as being isolationist.
Okay.
That's encouraging the longevity of cultural stories, like local stories to local audiences. I think that's actually a really smart move. Don't you? Like,
It seems like a better way to do it than to try to reject everything external. Just promote what's internal instead.
Okay. So just sort of create financial incentives to encourage those stories to be told.
Yeah.
I
It's
think
important that those
primarily
stories get told.
representation matters. So if you have girls in that culture that are seeing nothing but American actresses wearing American clothing, doing American things.
With American ideas of beauty.
Exactly. So it's nice to have that diversity so that if a girl or anybody goes to a theater can see someone that looks like them, talks like them, acts like them, dresses like them, and maybe they also can be the hero. I think that, or is represented in a way in their culture as being a hero or that sort of thing is important. So I support them supporting that.
And so do you think that this carries beyond culture to technology as well? Where you could say, look, we don't like that the way, whatever, the American invention of social media has affected has pervaded us and affected our culture. We're not going to allow technologies that change culture into, because that's kind of what it seems like they did here, right? Like they weren't just blocking out intergalactic species from like knowledge, but they're blocking out their technological knowledge as well, as you get the impression.
Right. I don't know. You could argue it, either way. I know that's hedging.
Yeah.
But for me personally, I don't think that's right. Or I don't think that's the best thing to do. There are, again, as we said, there are better ways to promote your own culture and to maintain your own culture while still integrating with other societies.
All right. Sarah, same thing? You think technology is agnostic as opposed to stories and other things? Because it doesn't always seem agnostic, right? Like, it's one of those things
Well,
where it's like,
mean,
first we sell you the Coca-Cola, then we have to sell you the dental hygiene and the toothpaste, like, all that. Like,
That's, yeah.
and I mean,
That.
soft drinks are a type of technology, right? It's...
I mean, the social media example is a really good example because it's really tricky. I mean, that's way more complicated than it just seems on its face, because we have problems with social media just as Americans.
Yeah.
The choice whether or not to regulate what is put onto it.
Mm-hmm.
So each of the social media companies have to make that decision for themselves. And they're banned in certain parts of the world because of content that they choose to allow or content that they choose to ban. And then their rules are different in different countries too.
Yeah.
So
I think knowledge is super important, and even if we're concerned about our own cultural identity, what if there comes to be a situation where there's an issue on Earth and we need to solve it and we don't have the technology for it, but it's literally every other planet out there has that technology that could save us, and we have just shunned ourselves off, that we have put ourselves in like a sitting duck situation. So I think knowledge is power. I think there's so much to learn from these other cultures, even though we may not see it. I think it's important to have that relationship with those people, and not doing so for fear of losing your own cultural identity, I don't think is worth it.
that totally reminds me of the story of the man on the roof with the flood.
No,
and
what's
a guy
that?
in a rowboat comes by. So there's a flood, and there's a man standing on his roof, and a guy in a rowboat comes by, and he offers to take the man, and he says, "Don't worry, God will save me."
Oh,
And
I
then,
have heard this story.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
then a guy with a helicopter comes by, and he said, "Don't worry, God will save me." Well, he drowns and dies. He goes up to heaven and asks God, "Why didn't you save me?" And God says, "I sent you a rowboat, and I sent you a helicopter."
Right.
So what Ashley
Yeah.
just said about like we're denying, the people in the story are denying themselves access to all of this technology that's out there in the universe when it could possibly solve a lot of problems.
Right.
Right. When it's not the technology that's the problem, it's the way it's applied or used.
Well,
or...
I think it's out of fear. Their fear of losing their cultural identity and their relationship to God, in this sense, that they're willing to shut themselves out completely.
Yeah.
To preserve just their cultural identity. And that goes to question number one. I feel like if you have established a strong enough communal bond and relationship of that culture within the society, then an outsider really shouldn't come in and permeate, because there's like a self, like a self-identity to that being in a way. It shouldn't rock you to the core. And so it was like, should we take steps to safeguard a culture? Well, if a culture is so great, it should continue on, and if it's not, then it's got to adapt. Like, I don't know, like
Yeah. Well, but it's interesting because like we've seen growing up in Arizona, we've seen both, and we'll move on from this in a second. But I'm just we've seen both Native American culture, which I think has gotten there's been a lot of cultural genocide, I think you could argue. And then not long ago, we were in New Zealand and we saw Maori culture, which continues to
thrive. It's accepted in the country. They celebrate it. It's now their native language is English, but also Maori.
Yeah.
It's like they have come back and fought for their identity and their acknowledgement that they exist. And so I think that if they want, I don't know, if a culture is strong enough in their bond and identity of who they are and the importance that they seek in themselves, there is a way for them to progress forward into the future without losing that sense of self. and also without can interact without fear of losing that. I
get it. I think it sounds like I'm the one of the four of us that's a little more sympathetic here, in that
Right.
I don't know. I can see someday. I can imagine, and I think from a technology standpoint, you're like Ashley said, like you guys have said, you're pretty much effed as soon as you're like, hey, I don't want to like trade technology with other cultures. Like that's bad news, right? Because you can't invent everything internally. But I do have some sympathy for for let's take African American culture that has or any culture, I guess. You don't have to use that one. There's so many examples where it's like, well, no, you still have a cultural identity because that road sign is in Spanish or whatever. And it's like, no, I don't want a road sign. Like, I want to.
So you have to understand, for example, what happened in New Zealand didn't take a day or a week.
Yeah.
It took years of showing up, being public, interacting with society, and saying, hey, we aren't these villainous people that you think we are. Let me show you what we're all about.
Yeah.
So we went to an actual native Maori village. People still live there. They live off the land. They still take the hot water baths from the bubbling springs.
Yeah.
Like ways that they used to do it hundreds of years ago. They're still doing it. And they've welcomed foreigners in to see, this is our way of life. You can decide if you like it or not. But we're still very close into this. And yes, we have people that leave and then they come back, or people that decide just to stay. But they're not living in fear of dying out because they've made that relationship to the other people. I think to society as a whole. They fought for that.
Yeah, I think I don't know. All right, we'll move on. I don't want to spend too much time on this.
Okay.
I just feel like we're all talking about. I feel like we're all talking about like a level of cultural sensitivity that we assume has always existed, that really is like 40 years old.
Right.
And so
where we have not always been sensitive to indigent, right? Is that the right
indigenous.
word? Indigenous. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
Indigenous cultures.
Right.
When moving into an area.
I'm just sympathetic. At any rate, you want to get into the sins. That's the whole point of this. It sounds like everyone's prepped for the sin discussion. So let's talk about that. Ashley, I know you had some stuff you had highlighted that you wanted to talk about. Do you want to start, or do you want me to start asking questions?
Oh, no, you can go ahead. I had something else highlighted.
Okay. So we'll start off with the question number 2 then is, he does this whole review of cardinal sins, and he starts off with, I think, a really fascinating supposition, and that is that the temptation to sin coexists with sentience. Meaning that as soon as you can think like, I exist, do I want A or B, sin is like inherent in that process. Which I guess is a very Jesuit sort of thing to think. But I'm curious to hear what you guys think. Do you think that first mental leap is a fair one? Because then the rest of it sort of flows from that.
Well, I mean, you have to. I think you really have to look at, kind of what that definition is, and is sin then really just tied to choice? Because if your sentience is the ability to make decisions, to
then you might make wrong decisions.
Right. And all the sins are then tied to, I guess, vices of some way, which are, I mean, one way to look at it is the animal side of us. Is what those are all tied to. The desire for, the desire for food because you're biologically always prepping for famine. So anytime anything, fatty or salty comes along, it tastes really good to you because your body's like, we should eat a lot of this because there might not be any tomorrow. And so the idea of overcoming sins is overcoming vices that are part of that animal nature. And making the right choices, not because, and really not in a negation of your animal instincts, but what is the best for everybody involved. That is
So would you argue? Because Ashley and I had a little bit of a discussion about, because she's not a big person of faith, and so she's like, what sin? Why is this whole thing about sin? And I think the way that you approach it's an interesting way is that if you kind of remove the sort of Judeo-Christian version of like term sin as it relates to the story, you could be talking about something else, right? You could be talking about as soon as you're able to consciously make choices of A versus B, you now have the ability to choose immediate gratification versus sort of collective or delayed gratification.
Right.
And with the immediate gratification being defined as sin, right? Like I see something I want, and in my mind I'm like, should I just like burn down the house and take it? Or should I, whether it be food or reproductive, things or whatever, or
Right.
the other part of you, the non-sinning part of you, the sort of less animalistic part of you, says, like if everyone was that way, what would society look like? I'm not gonna do that. And so then we're just really talking about, but if you're using that definition, Jeremy, then what you're saying is as soon as you can choose, the wrong choice does exist. Therefore, sin does exist, according to the way the
Yeah.
Jesuit looks at it.
Yes. I would say that as soon as you can make a choice between selfishness and selflessness, if you really bring it down to that level, that's what is the base for that sin. In some ways, everything comes down to a utilitarian decision. Does this benefit me, or does this decision benefit other people?
Right? Do I want to go like grab
Or-
all of the crops and eat them,
Right.
or do I want to like not do that so that we can all grow crops?
Right. Or what is the cost of this decision? It's like it might benefit me in the short term, but in the long term, it's detrimental to everybody.
Sarah, what do you think? You think sin in whatever version we're trying to figure it out exists as soon as you get the choice?
Society creates its own definitions of what is a sin. And I really do think as soon as you have the choice, you have the choice between the right decision and the wrong decision. And I was totally going somewhere else with this. But I'll just say I agree with what Jeremy just said. And I'll just leave it at that. If it comes back to me, though.
Sorry, so let me ask one follow-up question to you or Jeremy or Ashley. Ashley's been kind of quiet this one. So does that mean that sort of definitionally sin can only be related to sort of non-trivial things? So if you look at what the 7 deadly sins are, they're all related to sort of stealing other people's stuff, raping other people's women, like all the things that like give you a momentary, a brief moment of sort of elevation while it sort of breaks down the collective ability to like move forward, right? So does that mean that sin can't be when you eat food, you don't open your hands up and show them to the sky first, because there doesn't really seem to be any purpose in that, in the sense of like it's not. You're saying it can't be like a ritualistic sin, I guess is what I'm saying, because it's not tied to some sort of immediate gratification versus delayed
It
gratification.
has to affect another person in the society.
Right.
Directly or
Not
indirectly.
necessarily. I mean, it could
No?
just be something that affects you. That could also be a sin. If you look at the Buddhist tradition is really nice because there are, depending on how you approach it, there are 108 sins in Buddhism.
How do you keep track of them all?
That's why it takes
I
so
don't know.
long to become a Buddhist. You have to memorize
Right.
them all.
Man.
And they don't really quantify them as sins. They're more like just offenses against Buddhism. But they're really defined down, and you could probably class them,
Sure.
in the same like 7 categories. Like just baseness is a Buddhist sin. I was just looking at it earlier, and we'd have to go back and look at the list. But there's a lot of different.
I've seen those
but
Buddhas.
they're
Apparently
just-
gluttony isn't a sin. They all got the bellies going on.
Well,
man.
But
I'm
it is
actually
one of
reading,
the-
Yeah.
women
Gluttony
in
is one of their
Buddhism.
sins.
Yeah.
One of the issues was they can't handle money, and this lady was going on a flight to go to a Buddhist convention, and she can't accept food before a certain time.
Mm.
So they literally had to have a girl come with her carrying her like breakfast so she could hand her the breakfast because she couldn't buy food at the airport.
That sounds more like dogma.
And she couldn't. Yeah, she couldn't like handle her food. Like she couldn't until a certain time, like until the sun came up when her flight was in the morning. So her friend had to come with her, and then
I think dogma is sometimes like the simplified way to like prevent sin, right? Like what we really want to say is like don't go like murdering and stealing people. But we're gonna like make that in some like thou shalt not kill, right? Where it's like we don't really mean it exactly that. We mean like don't do it in this way and this type, like with as an offense, as a like if somebody's coming at you, bro, like do what you got to do.
Stand your ground.
Yeah.
Oof.
Only in Texas. Only in Texas.
Florida. You can do it
Florida too. Yeah.
This is exactly what I was going to say. As soon as you have choice and you have the ability to sin, you also develop the ability to sidestep it or to rationalize it.
Oh,
so like your lady who brought a friend along, her friend is doing the sinning for her, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So she's using her own free will, but she's just getting around
the particular rule.
Yeah.
Sidestepping the rule. You know, and that ends up being part of the problem with dogma, with following rules to the letter as opposed to, you know, what is this underlying principle that we're trying to put into the world?
Oh my God, that reminds me of a great story. Sorry, Ashley says I interrupt you too much, Jeremy. So if I do, just like let me know. But no, so when I was in Egypt, I there's no alcohol because Muslim country, and our tour guide, like we pulled up onto this thing, and the tour guide pulled over, and he's like lights up a joint and is smoking some weed, and he's like, "You want some?" And I'm like, "No, I don't smoke pot." And he's like, "But you drink alcohol?" And I'm like, "Yeah." I'm like, "Why don't you drink alcohol?" He's like, "Well, because it's forbidden." Hi, this is Colby, and you are listening to After Dinner Conversation, short stories for long discussions. But you already knew that, didn't you? If you'd like to support what we do at After Dinner Conversation, head on over to our Patreon page at patreon.com/After Dinner Conversation. That's right, for as little as $5 a month, you can support thoughtful conversations like the one you're listening to. And as an added incentive for being a Patreon supporter, you'll get early access to new short stories and ad-free podcasts, meaning you'll never have to listen to this blurb again. At higher levels of support, you'll be able to vote on which short stories become podcast discussions, and you'll even be able to submit questions for us to discuss during these podcasts. Thank you for listening, and thank you for being the kind of person that supports thoughtful discussion. And he's like, "But you drink alcohol?" And I'm like, "Yeah." I'm like, "Why don't you drink alcohol?" He's like, "Well, because it's forbidden under Islamic law." And I was like, "So would you shoot up heroin?" He's like, "Well, yeah, that's fine." And I'm like, "Dude, like I think you're missing the point here. The point isn't don't drink alcohol. The point is like don't modify your mental state." But he was totally cool with like, "Hey, if I can get access to meth, like more power to me." Yeah. But I'm not touching the booze because that's in the Quran. And I was like,
coffee's bad. Coffee's bad, but soda's okay.
Right, yeah. That's another one, right? And Mormons, right?
Yeah, specifically.
Yeah. And so I think that's the thing when you start doing this dogmatic thing is you're missing the underlying point. And that is like, you know, be cool to yourself and be cool to other people or whatever.
Well, it's a little convenient to miss the underlying point as long as you're following the letter of the rule, right?
Right. Yeah, that's true. All right, so let's get to the other part of the story here then. So what did you guys think of the argument of the species, that they really were without sin? Do you think that's...
Actually, I want to bring that back. Okay. What she just said brings us back to Pascal's wager.
Okay, which is in this story this time.
Yes, where you're really you're following the letter of the law to get the treat. At the end. Yeah. Yes. So.
Yeah, that's a good point. Sorry, sir, I didn't mean to cut you off.
But go ahead. So, the next part.
So, next part. What did you think of the actual like premise of the story? That there were these like 6 civilizations without... Sarah's shaking her head no. Ashley's like got notes she's been like dying to like talk about.
So the way that they kept like describing each scenario and each species, I just kept thinking of them as like trees or plants. Like the flower blooms not in jealousy or fear of what the other flower is going to look like. The flower just blooms because that's what it does. And it's like it doesn't compare itself to the flower next to it. And so I felt like all of the examples were so simplistic like that I was just like,
Yes,
I
that's exactly what I
people-
thought too, Ashley.
thank you! High five.
High five.
And
I
then
said they were vague. They were vague and two-dimensional.
Okay, well,
Yes.
I want to say that was kind of the point, is that some of these species looked, they were mistaken for not being sentient until, in several of the cases, they had to reach out and communicate, figure out how to communicate, because they were sentient, but by all appearances, they were just rocks. One of them, they were just rocks. They didn't move. And all of a sudden, they all had to communicate to talk to their hosts, or, in that one particular scenario.
So
I think that was the point, was in these cases, these creatures, from what we're expecting to be sentient creatures, they don't match up to those, but, underneath that, they actually were. I think that was the point of that.
So if that was kind of the case, then maybe we're just lacking a way of communicating with own species on Earth, because we know
Absolutely.
if you play a tree certain type of music, it grows better. Like if you play another type of music, it doesn't grow better. Maybe we're just missing how to communicate with the tree. And I mean, in that case, then is a tree a sentient being?
Potentially. If you look at, I don't know, is it the redwoods, or there are forests that are effectively, and I think it's the redwoods, where they are all the same creature. It is.
Yeah, they
are
underlock all of their trunks.
They share
Right,
water
so
under
it
the
is-
root system, yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
and it's one enormous organism. So it could potentially be sentient as well. They've done studies where they've monitored trees in an area where the trees that are dying suddenly will dump all of their nutrients into the soil so that the other trees can pick them up. And that there's
Again,
things like that.
Is it thinking that, or is it just like,
Right.
or
is
it's
it
the
just
right humidity, it's the right temperature.
Yes.
Now I release my blossom. Like
Exactly. No, there are two sides to it. It could just be, a lot of things we don't know about how trees interact. They're interacting, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're sentient. It is one large organism, so it has a lot of larger processes that are just not visible to us. It would be different if they did suddenly start broadcasting in in a radio spectrum trying to communicate with us. That would be different. It's a complex organism. It's not necessarily sentient.
yeah.
Sarah, you're shaking your head. What did you think?
The idea that these other species were, they all seem to lack a certain amount of free will. So that's not really a solid comparison for like being completely without a certain sin. I mean, the trees, they move, and like if you have a plant and you turn it towards the sun, it will grow in that direction. If you turn it around, it grows towards that direction. Experiments with plants opening at certain times of day, you can train them because you drop water on them, and they anticipate that. They have some sort of memory. But they don't really have the same free will. They don't have the ability to sin. So the descriptions of the other species made me uncomfortable. Like, this was a very ethnocentric kind of description and really overly simplistic. And
All right, so let me
so I think
jump
a lot
in.
of the point of it was kind of lost on me because I got caught up in.
I think that's what Ashley had the same issue with.
Same.
So let me modify the story just a little bit in a way that I think the author was intending, but maybe didn't come through as clearly. Because we talked earlier, and this is why I wanted to set it up with the beginning part, that as soon as you can make choices, you could make the wrong choice for sort of immediate gratification versus delayed or group gratification or whatever. I think what he's trying to say is there are species for which one of the things that give rise to our sins isn't an act done by choice. Therefore, they're incapable of sinning. So let's take humans, for example. Let's say that in the case of humans, the way that we reproduced was like once a month, we were all on the same cycle, and that once a month, just like pollen shot up from the top of our heads into the wind and went everywhere. And
so much dander.
And we didn't know, so much dandruff, right? And we didn't know.
Head and Shoulders going to make a killing.
Right. And we didn't know where it was going to land or who was going to get it. It was a biological act, so we couldn't stop it from happening. We couldn't control it. All of these sort of things, like if the act of reproduction is no longer a choice where you can make a wrong choice, is it no longer capable of being a sin in the sense of sort of lust or whatever goes along with that? I think that's what he was trying to get at.
Yeah.
But maybe not in as clear of a way as that.
You don't think people are going to try to manipulate and catch their dander and like, Joe,
have like shower caps?
We've got all the North American people share their dander. Don't share them with the Australian or,
Yeah.
There's people are going to want to manipulate it in some way. So
Not necessarily. There has to be some benefit from it, some way to edge out the other person, and I think that is with the one where it takes the whole culture has to be there for them to reproduce, and I think that's the idea. It's a biological act that doesn't have choice associated with it. So you can't choose a partner. So there's no way to turn that into
a sin, a bad choice.
Yeah.
And
right.
another example they used was with something that doesn't intentionally eat. It just absorbs the nutrients from the surrounding sort of whatever sulfur thing.
Right, so it can't be gluttonous.
Right, and so the question is like, so if we didn't have to eat, if we just sort of absorbed our nutrients that we needed from the air around us, could we be gluttonous? Or would the fact that it's not even a conscious choice, meaning it's not a sin option?
So if you want to go that way, look at breathing. Like if you make breathing more air than you needed,
right?
Like you literally can't. So it's
right.
not. It's
so we
not,
we can never be gluttonous as it relates to breathing.
As it relates to breathing.
I don't know. Oxygen gets you high.
That's a good point. Well, so there is a second part to this I wanted to discuss, but I didn't want. You're jumping ahead, but yeah, that's the question. So let's take breathing. Breathing's a great example. It's really hard to be gluttonous as it relates to breathing, or gluttonous as it relates to sunlight, for example. Like if we got all our energy from the sun, and yet, is it simply in our nature to want more of what we don't even have a choice in, right? So let's use the breathing example. Like at no point has anyone ever said, like, I want to hoard all the breathing. I want to hoard all the air.
We will, though. Like, if our air gets bad enough, there's going to be, like, look at pollution. Like, people are going to want to...
But that's tied to the scarcity, right? And that's the premise. The premise is there is no scarcity. There is no wrong collective choice.
Once you introduce scarcity, then yes, there's
or
ways to
voluntary,
hoard it.
Isn't that exactly what we're dealing with in hospitals and a shortage of ventilators?
Yeah. It's a great point. So does that change your opinion at all, Sarah, on this story, or do you still think like, meh? Because his basic premise is, I think, if there is abundance and if it is an involuntary act, it is an unsinnable act. I think this is a premise.
No, and I think he's valid in that.
Wow, the boys are the yes, and the girls are the skeptical.
For that particular example, they can't be gluttonous.
Yeah.
You know.
So look at the first example where they're talking about wrath.
Uh-huh.
That one. So the thing that bothered me about that one, I liked there just wasn't a very good explanation about why they didn't suffer wrath.
Mhm.
And the characters themselves did not have. He literally says their only purpose is these light shows, these bioluminescent light shows. That doesn't make for a very convincing species that this is a real thing and they can
Right.
be free from wrath.
Mm.
And there's no real choice in there. They're kind of like plants or insects.
Right.
They're not really exercising any kind of free will. So I think in order for us to say that a society is free from one of these sins, they have to make the choice to not do that sin.
Well, that sounds impossible, though. To have an entire society that has collectively agreed not to whatever.
Right, that's my problem with the story.
Yeah. I can see where, no, if that's the way you read it, that's a real problem with the story. I agree.
I think the big problem is we're taking our own definition of sins and trying to put them on another species that don't even follow the same life as us. So it'd be like another species saying, oh, you're using your hands, that's a sin. And then they look at us and they're like, but you're breathing air voluntarily. Like, to them, maybe to them, air is considered one of the choices for them.
Right.
And so they look at us as being without
because
sin.
oxygen gets you high.
they look at us as being without sin because we breathe. We don't control the air, you know. And so I that's the thing, is they're trying to extrapolate our sins and apply them to these other cultures, and they just don't compute. It's apples to oranges.
And he's looking at these other little societies purely from a Jesuit perspective.
Yeah.
And
That's
so
a good point.
that makes it really interesting, but I think that's also why it feels kind of racist a little bit.
Tone
like
deaf.
Say that again, Jeremy?
Why it feels a little tone deaf.
Oh, yeah. That's fair.
Because it really is just from this perspective, this one perspective, and not considering other perspectives of this culture as well.
I mean, think about the way that white European anthropologists used to write about indigenous cultures around the world. They characterized these people who had very rich societies and rich cultures as being
primitive,
simplistic and primitive. And I feel like
Yeah.
the Jesuit in this, who's the character, was doing the same thing to these societies, and that's what made me kind of like squeamish about it.
Well, what really made me squeamish on this story is when he's talking about our galactic confederates could be proof of our divine abandonment, but they could also be proof of our unique relationship to our creator. I chose to believe the latter because only good can come from that choice of faith. So it's like, why can't you believe that their creator really has made you imperfect? Like, the fact that maybe he was like, oh, I tried to create you perfect, but, you know, my bad. Gonna go to these other creatures instead and try to make him even more perfect. It's a unreliable narrator. He wants to believe this one thing that God is still with you, and it's like, you really can't believe that he's not. Like, you can't just let it go. Like,
so it sounds like you and Sarah have the same issue, right? Like, he's finding these things because he's looking through a very narrow cultural lens.
Yeah.
And like,
yes,
if you're looking for if you're looking for these 6 things or 7 things, then every time you come up with a culture or a new sentient being, it's going to look kind of odd to sort of layer this sort of bias onto something that's irrelevant to. If I'm maybe paraphrasing correctly.
Yeah.
That sounds right.
Okay.
So my whole thing came out of it is, come back to me.
All right.
It was one of the other questions.
So
it was question number 5.
You want to get to that one?
How would it affect your relationship to God? Like, does he exist, going to heaven, that whole thing? He's coming out with such a very narrow mind of faith. Like, what about all the other faiths? They don't. I don't know.
So okay. So question 5 says, the narrator says our galactic confederates could be proof of our divine abandonment, meaning that like God has got like other species on the side that he cares about. but they could also be proof of our unique relationship to our Creator, meaning that because we're the only one who can commit all these sins, we're the only ones that He's properly testing or something like that.
No, if we found life on other planets, how do you think that would affect your relationship with God? I'd be like, hey, we're just another species. We're just another animal.
Yeah.
The only thing that makes us different on this planet is our brains that allow us to have abstract thought so far that we are aware of. And I hate that people use religion to think that we're something greater than we are. That's for me what it comes down to.
To make us feel like we're special.
Yes.
Yeah.
I truly believe we aren't more special than any other creature on this planet, except for that our brain can have abstract, crazy thought.
Yeah.
At the core, we are just another animal species.
That our brains happen to be our evolutionary advantage as opposed to claws or shells or whatever.
Yes, definitely.
So here's the part of the story that it got me thinking about quite a bit.
So I think people are afraid of realizing that they aren't special anymore.
Sure.
It's like telling every kid, you get a participation medal and you're special and you're special. And then we're finally taking away that person telling us that we're special. We're all going to be toddlers having a temper tantrum.
Right. And, if your religious text is telling you you're special because your relationship to God is special, and there are all these other things in here that you have to believe, and if they're wrong, then your relationship to God is also in question. And that's the biggest problem, is taking these texts as historical documents about what came before means you have to reject any new information to the contrary.
Yeah. Yeah. The thing I got out of the story, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this, and maybe this is too sort of esoteric, is I was like Jeremy. I was much more apt to buy into the idea of the fact that sort of the choice creates the possibility for the wrong choice, therefore creates the sin, and therefore we come up with 6 or 7 sins based on the 6 or 7 things that the Christian faith believe we most often chose incorrectly for a collective good. But the thing that I found really interesting about the story is if we believe that those sins are tied to our choice and our sort of biological issues, that means there are an infinite number of sins because there are an infinite number of species that are simply designed differently, that have different types of choices that are relevant to their continued cooperative existence, right? So let me give you an example. So let's say that we were like a sentient moving tree species. Exactly. Well, a different sin.
I am Groot. Sorry,
right.
Go ahead.
So a sin might be gluttony, but the way that it would take place would be sort of hanging your canopy over other trees so that the sunlight didn't filter through to them, so they died, right?
Yes.
And so I can imagine that whatever the thing is for that species that is scarce that they rely upon would give rise to a different sin, one that hasn't even occurred to us because it's not something that is scarce that we rely upon. Like breathing, for example, until like pollution takes over, right? Maybe like breathing too deeply could be a sin in another culture, or exhaling in someone's face could be a sin in someone's culture because, the exhaling process is somehow poisonous, or you see what I'm saying? It gives rise to an infinite number of sins based on an infinite number of biological choices that we might not even have.
I think what's interesting about the cardinal sins that he's talking about is the sins that you're describing can also be described as one of these basic murder, lust, gluttony, greed.
They're umbrellas.
That's where we're coming
They're
from.
umbrellas, right?
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's maybe really hard to think of something other than these 7 because, even what you're saying about the trees, well, that could be gluttony and it could also be murder.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, and
so you have
maybe
to think
it's
of a different
wrath.
Concept.
Yeah. Like maybe
so I have to
going over another tree because
how about
they
the
had
fact
a fight.
Of just total misunderstanding. So using the example, say we're looking at a tree overshadowing another tree, it's killing the lower tree, and we're like, oh my gosh, that's murder. Well, to them, that tree needed to die or was already dying, and they were trying to speed up the process so the nutrients would be released to help. But there's no way for us to know. And so for them to, again, cut off this galactic confederation that is doing just observation in a way, without trying to put labels on it, they're literally just trying to observe these other species. I just think that's just information that you can't ignore. Like, that's so much you don't know.
Well, I mean, when he says at the end about the I choose to believe that it's evidence of our unique relationship with our creator because only good can come from that decision. I mean, is it really true that only good can come from that?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yep.
I don't know. That's the points you guys bring up are great. Like, maybe it is just an umbrella, right? And so maybe regardless of how many variations of life you create, it doesn't matter because it all fits under the same sort of umbrellas. I don't know. It's tough because it requires us to think of ways to be alive that we haven't ever thought of, right? And so it's like, think of the unthinkable. Yeah, no, I can't. Like, that's impossible.
Right, to try to think of another sin. Yeah,
which is maybe why it's so hard for him to write it.
That's why they say number 6 is sin a cultural construct. I think so, because you could look at another species could look at us and see that we are breathing as a sin, and we don't see it culturally as being one. That was question number 6. So
because it's not our thing.
Yeah.
It's not one. Yeah. But we could look at another species like a tree killing another tree by shadowing it, and we're like, that's murder. And they're like, no, it's really not. This is just the circle of life. Like, it all feeds into itself. It's not a bad thing.
Sarah, you've got like a very thinky face on. Do you want to get the last word on any of this, or are you?
No, I'm totally fine.
Okay,
I was just watching a cat. I was watching a cat with a concerned.
Oh, okay.
So wait, Colby was watching a concerned Sarah, who was watching a concerned cat?
No, I was concerned about the cat. I don't know.
Oh. I'm concerned about the cat now, too. I'm concerned that Colby's concerned that you're concerned about the cat.
Jeremy.
Oh, my God. Jeremy, I'm concerned about you now, too.
All right. Apparently I and maybe Jeremy liked the story more than the two of you did. I
would not say didn't like. I just had issues with some of the underlying. It's brought up a good thought.
It made me think
wasn't
like
bad.
It made me think like with sentience comes choice, with choice comes wrong choice, and with scarcity, or the ability to like hoard versus not hoard or whatever, immediate versus not immediate, comes sort of sin, right? And that's an innate thing. The only way you can get rid of sin is to get rid of choice, which is in some ways sort of slowly stripping away sentience.
Yes, I would agree with that.
I don't know. That's the thing I thought was really clever, even though it was really hard for the author to come up with examples.
Yeah, I mean, it's a valiant effort to try to come up with creatures and cultures that are devoid of sins, even if it's just the one.
You know what might have made the cultures more three-dimensional is if not only did he include examples about how they don't have a particular sin, but how they still sin in other ways.
Yeah,
sure.
That would have made the whole thing a little bit more believable and would have rounded them out as a species, like made them a little bit more
really
relatable.
Yeah, good examples of, they don't have wrath, but they still have lust in these ways. They still are gluttonous in these ways. They still are slovenly in these ways.
And I think
absolutely.
They don't tidy up their rocks at night. I mean, I think that's and I think that's the thing that would have made it feel more like fleshed out the way you're talking about, is if instead of trying to do all 6, he had just picked one and made it more of a traditional short story that focused on just one sin of one culture. That way we would have better understood their relationships, their interactions. It would have felt more story-like as opposed to survey-like. Maybe that would have made it easier, like taking a smaller bite at it.
I want to go learn about trees now.
Yeah, they're awesome. All right.
Now I'm gonna look into other cultures to find if we have any cultures on Earth where the definition of some of these sins is different. Now I'm
So
curious about that.
I do have an example, actually. Maybe this can be your thing. I didn't research this beforehand, so I didn't want to bring it up in case I was wrong. But I thought, like, decades ago, I had heard about a culture that didn't have greed, that was like one of the sort of lives in the African rainforest Aboriginal cultures. And the reason they don't have greed is because everything grows in the forest roughly the same amount in roughly abundance. And so, like, nobody fights over the stick because there's an infinite number of sticks. And nobody fights over the vegetation because there's an infinite amount of that vegetation. And so because they live in a primitive world where everything they need is in abundance,
And there's no way to hoard resources.
there's no way to hoard
create
it because
scarcity.
right, that there is in fact no sort of greed and covetousness, because it's just not possible, because there's nothing rare, right? I have no idea if that is true. That's like a 20-year-old memory I'm pulling up, but it'd be I don't know. Maybe after we're done with this, we'll all go research it.
Yeah.
All right. So, hey, you've been listening to After Dinner Conversation, short stories for long discussions with Colby and Ashley and Sarah and Jeremy. Join us next time. Please like and subscribe.
Go to the website afterdinnerconversation.com. You
There
can
you go.
find links to stories, podcasts, how to support us on Patreon, buying our book series, all sorts of goodies.
Yeah, all sorts of goodies. Hey, and thank you, and see you again soon. Bye. If you've enjoyed listening to this, please like and subscribe. It helps us out a ton. You know, the vast majority of people haven't liked and subscribed, which means maybe it shows up in your algorithm, maybe it doesn't. So don't leave that to chance. Just go ahead and hit that button, and we'd sure appreciate that. And that way we can keep doing what we're doing, and you're not left to the whims of some algorithm. Thanks.